And I will move next to our two distinguished academics and museum experts that will have a dialogue with each other. I want to welcome Dr. Spencer Crew, the Interim Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture of the Smithsonian Institution, and Alexandra Bounia, who is Professor of Museology at the Department of Cultural Technology and Communications of the University of the Aegean. They will have a discussion entitled Leading the Way Forward about museums, human rights, and social justice. So please let us welcome
Thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much to the organizers for giving us the opportunity to be here this afternoon and having a discussion. It is my great honor and pleasure to have this discussion this afternoon with a pioneer in museum and public history leadership, whose work over the years has been at the forefront of promoting. If I may just give a few words about, Dr. Crew's career is really long and very distinguished, and he has held so many different positions. So I'm just going to give just a very short account of the latest, let's say, or some of the most important career stops, let's say. Dr. Crew has worked in public history and memory institutions for more than 25 years. He started his career as an assistant professor of African American and American history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and he is currently the professor of history at the George Mason University. In 1981, he joined the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian, and in 1987, he curated an exhibition which is like a milestone in this area, entitled Field to Factory, African American Migration, 1915 to 1940. He was also consultant for the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, and the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham, Alabama. Dr. Crew was the director of the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian from 1994 until 2001. From 2001 to 2008, Dr. Crew was the director and president of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was appointed the interim director of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture in 2019. Previously, he had developed Defending Freedom, Defining Freedom, Era of Segregation, 1876, 1968. This is part of the permanent exhibition of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So, Dr. Crew, it's a great pleasure to have you here this afternoon.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and very honored to be a part of this session.
Thank you. I'm going to start with something that came up from our keynotes. Both Elizabeth Maid and Anna Seiler in their keynotes just a few minutes ago argued that social inequality and lack of representation, or the silences in museums, are threats to our democratic system, and that museums contribute to and perpetuate racial inequalities and social justice issues. And they need to move beyond this paradigm, beyond the current paradigm, towards a new definition or a new content, towards providing more equal and equitable access to cultural assets and social assets. So I would like to start the discussion from this point and ask you about your experience based on your long and distinguished career and all the positions that you have held these years. How is historical work undertaken by institutions like museums are valuable or relevant to current societal challenges? How can museums contribute to the development of critical citizen skills based on your experience and your, the institutions that you're running and you have run in the past?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that my background and most of my experience in museums have been at history museums. And always the task that we've had before us is how do we provide a history that is diverse, a history that is rich in the contributions of a wide variety of people to the history of the nation, and begin to introduce to visitors this richness of contributions that are part of the creation of the museum, of the history of the nation. Too often there's been a single thread of interpreting history, which looks at the great men mostly, and the movers and the shakers, and really has ignored the people who are at the lower levels of society, or who are on the fringes of society, or not considered to be central to society. And what it's always been our sense at a history museum is that we need to broaden that story to ensure that visitors begin to see how other people have helped to influence the creation of the nation. And what that will do, I think, is allow many people to see where their background, their family, their genealogy has an important role to play in the nation as well. And the more we can do that, I think the more we will create an appreciation among groups for the importance that each group has to the well-being and the development and the growth and the importance of that nation.
In other words, letting people find themselves in the museum is a key thing, right?
Absolutely. If you can find yourself, find stories that connect to you, I think it draws you into the story and allows you to think more broadly and more richly about what you can learn.
How does the Museum of the National Museum of African American History and Culture does that in its everyday practice? Give us a few examples of what the museum does to this direction these days.
Yes, well, the first thing to keep in mind is that really the mantra for our museum is that what we try to do at the National Museum of African American History and Culture is to talk about American history with through an African American lens. So essentially what we are saying is that while American history stories that you've heard are important to understand, there are other ways of beginning to see how that story has unfolded. What are the wonderful things that have happened, but also what are some of the challenges that the nation faced in the process of thinking about what are supposed to be the foundational credos or principles of the nation, which are freedom and equality and liberty. And how have we as a nation begun to confront those issues? Who have we folded under that tent, and how have we slowly but surely begun to change how we see the different aspects of our community? So what you will find in the National Museum of African American History and Culture are lots of exhibitions that begin to offer a perspective on American history, but use African American experiences as a way of telling that story. So our history exhibitions will look at American history, but begin to fold in key moments in African American history to show how they've influenced the larger culture. We also have exhibitions that look at culture, that look at community, and I think through that begin to illustrate how African American impact on culture has shaped what is an American culture. It wouldn't be the same without African American culture. We also talk about the richness of the African American community itself and what are the things that have been accomplished there, because too often the perspective that's provided is that it is a community that is a deficit, that that is not contributing at all to the nation, but it's a drain on it. And what we're trying to illustrate is that in fact is not the case, but in addition, that there are sort of in structural laws and structural activities in the nation's fabric that make it difficult for different groups to have access to the kind of opportunity that we'd like everyone to have. So what we're trying to do is to offer new information to our visitors so they can begin to see the operation of the nation and the issues that face the nation in a different light. What has often delighted us is that when our visitors have come, what we hear back is that I didn't know many of these things. This is a revelation to me. It's offered me a new perspective on thinking about American history. And we feel if we're doing that, that we're being successful in trying to really help change the view that people have about the nation's history.
Right, thank you so much. Can I move on to a next issue and connect it a little bit with leadership as well? Many museums around the world reacted to the movement Black Lives Matter, issuing support statements or even bringing statues down. Is this enough? Should the museums react to what is happening in society, so to contemporary debates on critical topics? or should they try to address these issues beforehand? In other words, what is the role of the museum? Should they have a more proactive role into trying to work towards more equal societies, or should they just lean back and wait for things to be raised and then sort of come into the game and you know, reinforce the argument or endorse the argument?
Well, from our perspective, the role of the museum is to be a leader in that conversation, that we want to ensure that issues that create inequality in society are brought forward so that visitors begin to see the world in a different light. There may be points of view that visitors bring that come out of their own personal experience. And I think our task is to allow them to step beyond their personal experience to see a wider variety of issues that are important to the society. And the role of a museum, I think, is to at least raise the level of knowledge that people have around these kinds of issues. I'm not sure we can always force people to change how they think or can expect that they will, but we can at least create some more basis of information on which they're making decisions about how they see society and how they navigate it. And I think that is an important role for museums to play, so offer this richness of opportunities of new ideas so that our visitors can begin to see the world in different kinds of ways.
And again, I'm going to ask you for specific examples from the museum that you're leading. How is this happening in your institution? How do you take things forward before your eyes in the public sphere?
Well, I think the most effective way that we've done that is through the programming that we do as an institution. We have a number of programs we do in which we really try to bring people together and have them begin to have a chance to talk and to think differently about how they see the world. One important program we have is called A Seat at the Table. And essentially what we will do is bring in a diverse group of individuals. We will have a presenter sort of give some information around a topic like a religion or activism or race. And then at the table, we make sure we have sprinkled it with a variety of people with different perspectives. And over food, we have them then talk about the ideas that are raised by the speaker or the facilitator, and to share back and forth what they're thinking, and then to have one of the individuals at the table serve as a reporter who will report out what they have talked about. And what we then have them do is each table to have someone report out. So the idea is to create a safe environment for conversation, but also an environment in which people can begin to see different perspectives. And our hope is that what evolves from that is that people have a much more open sense of what are the challenges that people they don't know, lives, ways of living they don't know, the challenges that these individuals have as part of the society, and maybe cause them to see those issues in a different way, in a more sympathetic way. So our programming, I think, has been a key way of doing that. We also have turned, I think, a great deal to use of the web as a place in which you can have conversations take place. And I think one of the most interesting things that we did was to have what we called a poetry slam. And we opened up our webpage and invited people to share poetry, to share ideas, to share stories that talk about their feelings about social issues. And what it does is, I think it allows, again, a variety of perspective and feelings to come into these spaces that are actually international public spaces, so that, again, people have a chance to be exposed to different ways of seeing the world. What is important in I think our mind is that by exposing individuals to different perspectives, it allows them a chance to grow.
Yes, this is amazing. This is definitely so. Can I just follow on from that word that you use, that phrase that you use, which is used quite a lot in museums these days. Museums are safe environments, or can be safe environments where people can start dialogues and they can communicate. And I think that this resonates with what Anna was describing before about museums being spaces not activist, but not academic either. So a new kind of space, a third space. There are many voices in the museum world these days that say exactly the opposite. They say that museums should become very active political spaces, where, not just quiet leaders, to use the word that, the phrase that Mrs. Caradodi used before, but actually vocal leaders. So become spaces where we don't just provide a room for dialogue or space for dialogue, but become spaces where there are active political discussions, heated political discussions take place, and museums take a role, an activist role in society. How do you feel about that?
I think that has relevance, and I think it has resonance to it, but I think you also want to consider how and when you do that. That I think that for us, it is through our programming that we try to create those kind of spaces for conversations that may have different points of view brought with them. I think what we do through our exhibitions is to introduce new ideas, introduce perspectives that fit with the philosophy of the museum, which I think makes us activists, but we also try to create a space in which we can get people to come in and engage with the ideas. Sometimes if you're too forthright and too exclusive in what you do, you really then exclude individuals who may not share those points of view, who will resist coming in. And I think part of the perspective is, how do you get individuals who may share a different perspective to engage in those ideas? And I think that's a very fine-tuning approach. And it's important that in our spaces, we create opportunities for a wide variety of individuals to be able to interact together. Otherwise, what you wind up doing is just preaching to the choir. And that's a wonderful feeling, but I'm not sure it actually helps to move the needle forward in terms of how the society can change and grow and become better. So part of the strategy is, how do you position yourself so that you can create change? And change means helping others who may not share your point of view to get new perspectives and maybe then alter their point of view as well.
Right, thank you so much. I will take one of the questions asked in the chat from one of the people in the audience. The question goes, two current phenomena have been affecting the African American communities: the COVID-19 that has hit hard the Black community, and the Black Lives Matter movement. Does your museum monitor and record these situations? Do you see them as opportunities for future programs and presentations? And I will add to that, do you see that as another, do you see it as an area of collecting as well? Do you do something in that perspective too?
Yes, the short answer is yes, we believe in collecting in those areas. And yes, we've done work in terms of trying to capture those experiences. I'll give you a couple of examples. During the social justice activities in Washington, D.C., we had our curators actually going out and talking to those individuals. We were collecting the posters, we were collecting the signs, we were collecting the textiles and flags that people were creating. But just as importantly, what we were doing was we were conducting oral interviews of those individuals. So we could capture what were the passions, what were the ideas that were driving them, that made them want to come out and talk and to share their point of view. For us, that's important because partially what the role of a history museum is to capture that history and then to be able to talk about that history to later generations. And for us, getting out and interacting with the social justice protesters was a chance to capture that data from the very beginning, so we'll have it for years later, but also to collect material culture, because in museums, as we know, exhibitions are dependent upon having the artifacts to help tell the story. So we wanted to make sure we captured those artifacts. Around COVID-19, we are collecting from particularly medical people who are in the midst of trying to care for those who are sick with that. But also we've done programs that speak to that issue as well. One of our programs was looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the African American community and other vulnerable communities in the nation, talking about what is going on there, but also offering some suggestions about what things people might do to help minimize or at least ease the impact on those communities, but also to explain why that's the fact. Because again, often the response is, well, why don't they just move, or why are they victims? Well, there are lots of reasons that people need to understand what has made people more vulnerable, not through their own choosing, but often very much because of the structure of society, economically and otherwise.
Thank you very much. I will turn to another question now. How do you envision the creation of the safe environment that we were talking about before in the digital sphere? Can museums be equally powerful in terms of representing a safe space when there is no physical presence and physical interaction?
Yes, I think we can, and it's how you structure your programming and how you structure your space. For example, in a good program, what you will try to do is to ensure that your speakers, your presenters offer different perspectives. That way you can draw in audiences that can begin to see the different ways in which you can look at these topics and understand them. And through that way, you become a place for conversation, a place for sometimes debate, but a place for learning. And I think in the end, that is an important task for us as museums, and that is to be educators and to help our audiences to be able to navigate a variety of pieces of information and then come up with decisions that are based on good facts as opposed to other kind of innuendos or disinformation that is very strong in our societies.
Thank you very much. Another question asks, there is a very interesting perspective that African-American outlets are not aiming to educate white audiences, even though during the last 6 months with the Black Lives Matter movement, that is quite a big phenomenon reflected in the zeitgeist. Should museums and institutions like yours mostly aim to propel conversation education or to give back to the community they are representing or enrich the same culture?
I think it's a balancing act. It's a great question. And I think that it's not either or. There is a space in the middle that we need to occupy. From the very beginning, the perspective of our museum from our founding director, who's now the secretary, Lonnie Bunch, was that we wanted to be a museum for all people. We wanted to talk about these stories from an African-American perspective, but we wanted to allow space for all people to come to see the stories. I think to find parallels in the African-American story, that parallel stories that are pertinent to them, and that way they can be drawn into it and to connect to the individuals that are highlighted in our stories. One of the key ways that we've tried to do that is through making sure our stories often were interspersed with personal histories of individuals, so that there are people that you connect to as you're learning this history, so that it becomes more engaging and good stories that capture people's imagination and allow them to put themselves in the same circumstance so that they might then better understand what's happening. One of the interesting spaces we have in the museum is what we call as interactive table. And at the table, what we try to do is to explain the kinds of decisions, the kinds of challenges facing civil rights workers and participants in the mid-50s and 60s in terms of choices they had to make, not knowing what the outcome might be. That, for example, freedom riders on the buses in the 1960s, before they agreed to go on the freedom rides into the South to integrate those bus stations, wrote their wills because they weren't sure what was going to happen. That changes how people think about that process. And I think it also touches people in a very personal kind of way. And these are the kind of things we're trying to do, is to help people understand emotionally as well as intellectually what goes into the kinds of challenges that are faced by individuals trying to create change in a society.
If I can put it in 3 words, emotional and intellectual empowerment.
Yes.
It's the message, right?
Absolutely. I think you captured that well.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we run out of time, but I would like to thank you very much for this brief but very fruitful and very interesting discussion. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be able to be a part of this conference.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, a big thank you to Alexandra Bounia and Spencer Crew for the inspiring and positive discussion. Really, one thing that's definitely missing from this conference is us being able to discuss further in the coffee break kind of thing, because all of us want to ask a lot of questions, want to meet with each other, and I really want to hope, let's cross our fingers together, that this time next year we will be able to do so.